language. And he had to invent some Hebrew words, and of course other Hebrew words have had to be invented for aeroplane and telephone and all those sort of things. It is said that if Jeremiah stood on the streets of Tel Aviv, he would be able to understand a lot of the Hebrew that was being spoken. Again, it's of God. These are miracles of the Lord, the wonderful things that the Lord himself is doing. In Isaiah 62, verses 1 to 7, talks about a fruitful marriage of the land and the people. No longer will they call you, that's the people, deserted, or name your land desolate, but you will be called Hephzibah, that's my delight is in her, and your land Beulah, married, for the Lord will take delight in you, and your land will be married. As a young man marries a maiden, so will your sons marry you. As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so will the Lord rejoice over you. When you have a happy, fruitful marriage, there's offspring. When Israel, the Jewish people, are back in the land has become fruitful again. Go to the Sinai. You know, parts of the Sinai were given back to Egypt. That fishery on top of Sinai was so fruitful that when the Egyptians took it over, it didn't produce fish again. There's something in the land and something with the people that God is blessing that wonderful land. But perhaps the greatest thing of all, because primarily, although I love Bible teaching, and as I was a pastor for 8 years, I'm really an evangelist. I want people to know and love the Lord. Firstly the Jewish people and then the Gentiles. And I think this is the most wonderful thing of all. Jewish people are coming to know and love Messiah. 5 years ago there were 5,000 Jewish believers in Jesus. Today there are 15,000 Jewish believers in Jesus. I was up in Yossi Avada's fellowship when there were about 4 different people with earphones, Hebrew, Russian and different languages, and he was preaching in Hebrew. And it's just wonderful what God is doing. And when you see Arabs and Jews getting together in a fellowship, isn't that wonderful? They're related, they're cousins. And that's what the Lord wants. And when you meet an Arab who says, yeah, we're just so pleased with what God is doing. We've got an Arab guy coming next Thursday to Arundel Town Hall. He's a pastor in Jerusalem. And he reaches out to the Jewish people and he blesses them and he blesses the Arabs. Doesn't that thrill your heart? That's what the Lord wants, and I want to go to that meeting. I know I'm going to be speaking here, probably the next day or whatever, but I want to meet this guy who actually has a heart, for the Jewish people, but a heart for everybody. And though I didn't actually ask permission, because I never like to ask permission in case somebody says no, but a guy called Jeff Fuchs, who's part of Prophetic Witness, was leading a tour, and there was about a dozen or so people, and he's gone to be with the Lord, which for him is much better. And I've been asked, would I lead this tour to Israel? First tour I've ever led, and it's on the 4th of November, and it is for a week, or 11 days actually, and I've brought some of those leaflets along if you want to see them. But I think the last thing I want to do is just talk to you about this. It's a Hebrew inscription, but I'm going to read it from the scripture. Don't get fooled by me. I'm sure Derek knows more Hebrew than I do. But just listen to this. Don't shout it out if you know what it is. Yivareka Adonai, v'yishmireka, Ya'er Adonai panav eleka, v'hu nekar, Yisar Adonai panav eleka, v'yasem leka shalom. What is it? That's right, it's the Aaronic blessing. It's not the Abraham, the Aaronic blessing. The oldest biblical text that we've ever discovered was found on the shoulder of Hinnom. As part of the Hinnom Valley. There was 2 of them. and it's the Aaronic blessing which goes back to King Solomon's time. And it has pride of place in the Israeli Museum. Now, if you want to buy your wife something, Derek, the next time you go to Israel, because I got my wife, they're a little bit smaller than that actually, a bit smaller, and I got one for my wife to hang on my neck, just a replica of what the, of what the Aaronic blessing says. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you. The Lord lift up the light of his countenance upon you and give you his peace, his shalom. And that was found in 1979, 30 years later. Dead Sea Scrolls first, and then the Aaronic blessing. Isn't that God? Again, blessing his people. And I've sometimes stood in Israel, and I've seen a Jewish man, and I've just said very quietly the Aaronic blessing, and suddenly I'm overwhelmed by the Spirit of God. Because I want to bless God's people, but it's the Lord's blessing, isn't it? The Lord bless you, and the Lord keep you. The Lord causes his face to shine upon you, and it just moves you, and it just thrills you, and it's just so wonderful. Well, I planned that I would only be this short time, but I will be there at the stand, and I will explain things to you, and I'm happy to take people through the exhibition, which starts here, and of course goes in a clockwise motion to the end. But thank you ever so much for being so patient with me. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you, Tristan, very much. Always fascinating to listen to stories and see events take place and see the history that's unfolded in our times, really. It is... So thank you, Tristan, very much. And if you want to hear more from Tristan and see more of his exhibitions, then do come to the London Convention at Westminster Chapel in June the 8th, Saturday. We have a good number of people there. Lance Lambert is our regular featured speaker at the convention. But we also have invited a couple of Israeli believers to come as well, Messianic believers who actually do a ministry in the land, apart from what Lance is doing, which is to the wider world. Pastor Dov Bikas, who is a Russian pastor and works on the streets of Tel Aviv. He runs a ministry called the Aviv Center in Tel Aviv that reaches out to alcoholics, drug addicts, and prostitutes in the red light district of Tel Aviv. So Dov and his wife Olga have been believers maybe over 25 years. They came to faith in under the ministry of John Pex in the shelter in Eilat. Back in the late 80s he came to faith, sleeping on the beach in Eilat. And John Pex, if you know about the ministry of the shelter in Eilat, reaches out to people who come down to Eilat for all sorts of reasons. But so Dov came to faith and then began to be pastoring a Russian congregation in Arad, and then he moved to Yavne. His son Yossi, their son, Dov and Olga's son Yossi, was born to them about 17 years ago with muscular dystrophy, and sadly at the end of last year their son Yossi died. But we thank God that they're still called and still serving the Lord on the streets of Tel Aviv. And alongside Dov now are other people. Anat and Ishai Brenner from Kfar Saba just outside Tel Aviv work amongst prostitutes as well. Anat runs a nail bar, for example, that's looking after the feet of prostitutes because they get into a terrible state. Anat, she washes the feet of the prostitutes. It's a very powerful ministry. And then there's another man, Maxim Davidov, who's another Russian believer. He lives in Haifa, and he leads a Bethel men's hostel in Haifa. But so he's coming as well with Dov and sharing about the work in Tel Aviv, particularly at the London Convention. Because it's not just about hearing the word preached, but it's also hearing about what God is actually doing on the streets of Israel today. So it's really connecting us with the ministry of the Lord in Israel at ground zero. So it's two different ways really of praying for Israel nationally, globally, internationally, strategically, all these sort of ways. Praying for Aliyah. It's very good to see the work here, which has been supported for 20 plus years, isn't it? Early 1990s particularly. But also it's lovely to have peers here as well from the Media Serve that produces Bibles and outreach literature to many countries of the world through Piers' father-in-law, isn't it? Frank and Lena Arthur, who live in Sweden. But they produce Bibles in Russian or all kinds of languages. Particularly the relationship with them is that they've been used to produce Bibles in Amharic for Ethiopia. So part of the Ethiopian Aliyah we've supported as well, seeing Ethiopian Jews integrated into Israel, but also trying to reach out to them whilst they're still in Ethiopia. So that's another ministry which is a joined up ministry. So different people doing what God has called them to is a wonderful array of his grace in these times. So London Convention is about a celebration of different ministries really. And so we've invited several other ministries too that dovetail into what we're doing, which is praying for Israel nationally, but praying for the congregations and the ministries that are operating now and weren't 25, 30 years ago. So there's much to pray for. But I thought what I'd just do now is maybe just to summarize really coming up to date with a historical view of Israel, because I think it's a miracle to be living in our day. Most of us are born probably around the wartime period and afterwards, some before, looking around maybe. Don't want to cast any dispersions on anybody, but these times, Second World War and onwards, have been very challenging but also remarkable times, and it's exciting to live in these days. Many people in the past have prayed for this day, and we're seeing it come to pass in our time. So 1948, I know Tristan reminds us of the formation of the modern state of Israel in 1948, May 1948. But also we've seen the restoration back to him as well, and particularly since the Six-Day War, 67 onwards, a realization within Israel that they're not there by accident, but they're there by design and plan of God. But they're not just to be his people in the land, but the people who know him. And seeing God turn the hearts of his Jewish people back to the Messiah of Israel, the Jewish Messiah first, Messiah Jesus, Yeshua, who came to save them from their sins, deliver them. So whilst the creative or recreative works of God have been fulfilled in our time, so are the redemptive works of God. So I want to just show you some pictures, if I can, a little historical overview, then we'll look at some